baby. This is my goddamn garage. This is my goddamn garage. Oh, baby, now my goddamn garage. Doing book reviews, my goddamn garage. Fine dollar now, my goddamn garage. What you talking about, my goddamn garage? Talking internet now, my goddamn garage. What you doing, baby, my goddamn garage? Let's go now. All right, I've been away for a little while, which is fine because the show has no real plan. Nonetheless, I'm going to be starting up again. This is season 2, and the basic reason for that is that summer hit, and I wanted to hang out with my kids down by the river and have a good time and not worry so much about making some silly show every week. But now they're back in school again, which means I have days off while they're at school, and what else to do with my time but make more of these things. So I'm going to start off season 2 with a review of Andrew Gilchrist's book, The Divine Daughter. I've had this in the can for months. I just haven't done anything with it. So here we go. Welcome to season 2. Talk to you soon. Agamemnon, who united the forces of Greece in preparation for the Trojan War, bringing him glory and fame, is also the man who sacrificed his daughter to Artemis in order to gain favorable weather. Some accounts have her secretly replaced by a deer in the last moment to work in the temple of Artemis. Nonetheless, the act devastated his wife and started the countdown towards his own death. Jephthah promised God that if the Israelites won the war, he'd sacrifice the first thing that came out his door when he got home, which ended up being his daughter. He was distraught, of course. She was gracious, asking for 2 months to wander the mountains and contemplate her virginity and her death. He carried through, though. The act was completed. You cannot break your promise to God. Jephthah did not receive the same mercy that Abraham did. Human sacrifice, archetypes, mythology, religion, story, and its purpose in our lives, count me in. Human sacrifice alone would have got my attention. The Divine Daughter starts us off by recounting the tales of Agamemnon and Jephthah. The book is ostensibly about the word daughter and how it's been used in story over the millennia, what that means for us, and what we can possibly do about it. And while it recounts dozens of stories from as many disciplines, it continually brings you back to those two men, Agamemnon and Jephthah. Andrew Gilchrist has written an interesting and unique book here. Psychology, philosophy, religion, sacrifice, divinity, the nature of the hero, and the word daughter as it relates to all of these concepts. And this isn't a feminist book, nor does it seem to push any kind of larger agenda. It is very much the work of an individual. I never felt as if he was trying to convince me of something, just relating his own thought process for me to consider, attempting to put his narrative into a larger conversation that has become somewhat of a tradition in Canadian intellectual life, especially at the University of Toronto. And this thought process, it does draw heavily from thinkers who came before Andrew, Northrop Frye and Marshall McLuhan especially, but also Camille Paglia, Jordan Peterson, Carl Rogers, Franz de Waal, Joseph Campbell, and dozens more. At times it can seem like an awful lot of separate stories are being told as Andrew jumps from place to place, recounting tales from different cultures and time periods. Yet with your two guides, Agamemnon and Jephthah, you are continually brought back again and again, and slowly a larger meta-narrative starts to form that makes the seemingly disparate ideas from various psychologists, heroes, philosophers, writers, inventors, all kind of come together into something new. When you read the back of the book, or the title, even just looking at the cover, which to me is beautiful but also faintly eerie in a way, where only the silhouette in the shadow is left, you may start to get an idea about what this book is about. And you'd be right, but you'd be missing something. At times, it seems as if this book is a process for Andrew, where he explores his own faith, philosophy, and who he's trying to become, as he tries to piece together a working structure for him to live with. And luckily for us, Andrew is a thoughtful and intelligent man, and his ideas are not only worth considering, but at times they're quite poetic as well. And it's really easy to read. I highly recommend this book. I'll leave a link to Andrew's YouTube channel down below in the description of this video, as well as a link to a conversation that him and I had. There will be one right after this. That is just a snippet that is about this book specifically, but there's a longer one down below. I was supposed to interview him, and well, I kind of forgot to focus on the interviewing part. Anyways, enjoy the conversation. Cheers.
I didn't necessarily write it thinking feminism in my head. And in fact, actually, in some ways, there was a response that way because I kept running into this thing time and time again. And I think I sort of explained that a little bit in the book where, like, Neumann, he's got this great mother figure, and it's this, uh, daughter, young mother, crone combo. It's all together. It's all just mother. And and then I'd go to talk to some of my friends, and they'd have that combo where, I've got an older friend that I, asked about the cover. Could you draw some? She's an artist. Could you draw something for that? And she immediately wanted to say, well, not just daughter. Let's put the whole spectrum of all roles that women have on the cover. And I was like, no, 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 no. I don't care about all that stuff. There's lots of literature out there about that. That fight's being done by people, and I'm not competent enough to do that. But we're missing something just in that idea of like a daughter, and the idea like it's not the individual, but it's what you're observing as an individual. And the more I was able to sort of round this out and read and read and read, I was thinking, oh, I don't have to look at this from a sex lens or a gender lens or a male, female, masculine, feminine lens. But what about like the hero and companion? What about the individual and their own observations when they look at themselves or look at others, and that kind of element? And that's where it's sort of the focus on the word daughter came from more than anything. But again, that's what I was aiming at. And well, I ended up where I ended up.
Well, it doesn't have a feminist vibe to it.
Okay.
Right. But it is talking about a child that does have a gender or a sex. Let's just say sex. Gender's become
yeah.
I'm trying to drop it from my vocabulary until I understand what it means again. I'm not smart enough to use that word anymore. So
that's a great way to put it, actually. I like that.
So, but this child does have a sex, and so it is easy to slide over into that category, but it doesn't, like, you're not quoting a lot of feminist thinkers. That's for sure. They might show up here and there, but it's not focused in that direction in any way. It's focused more around like a Joseph Campbell kind of approach, a more of a mythological approach.
Yeah.
In
some ways, it's really, all of my own obsessions came out because it's my book, right? I'm writing the book that I wanted to read. So of course I'm going to dip into all the people that I'm sort of wrestling with or that I'm working with.
Well, we're similar ages and we're similar background, and your story is very familiar to me. That's why it's so much like listening to an old friend, because I recognize the tone. I recognize the world that you're coming from, and the way you're able to shine a light on it from a perspective that I don't have. Experience is a muffled lantern that only sheds its light on the bearer. So you're able to show me perspectives of that same world that I inhabited, just slightly altered, right? And with different stories that I'm not familiar with. Some of them I am. Like, there'd be sections here where, like, I know this story very well, and then there'd be other sections where I'd had no clue. I was going to ask you, did you wrestle with the few stories that do exist that show these other, like, what about Susanna, for example, where she gets accused by the lecherous old men of either sleep with me, or you're going to be, or we're going to tell this story about how you screwed this other guy and we caught you. And she says, oh, I'd rather be a sinner in the eyes of men than in the eyes of God. And so the elders go and tell the people. They say, oh, she was with this young, hot guy. And one of them really emphasizes how hot the guy was. And you have to stone her now, because clearly she shouldn't be doing this, right? They don't even ask where the guy is, of course. And then Daniel the prophet leaps from the soil and says, no, these men are dirty liars, and she's innocent, and she gets saved.
Okay.
Did you wrestle with any of those types of stories?
That particular story, I certainly didn't wrestle with. And like so many other people out there, even with my background, with a pretty, decently devoted Christian family, I've got blind spots, like, for the entire Bible anyway. And so I was picking and choosing for what I'm familiar with.
Well, and it's also apocryphal too, by the way.
Okay. There was a story.
So I'll be honest about that. Like, they removed it, and they probably removed it for a reason, but nonetheless, it's there, and we do read it. You, like, some people do read it. So
yeah, true.
It still came from the tradition, right? And it's still a part of it. People just read it in non-canonical books.
Yes, yeah. There was a story in, I'm not sure where it is, but is it maybe the sons and daughters of David, maybe. And
Mhm.
there's one son that like basically has a crush on his sister
Right.
to the point that he ends up raping her. And I was very tempted to use that because again, it's sort of a, I think it's, it's standard, it's old, it's in there. And the perspectives were so ranged in the sense that he does all these, terrible deeds and then tries to deny it, tries to run away. It's almost like an immature boy story.
Hmm.
Whereas this girl has this totally practical like response. I wish I could remember her name now. Uh,
And she's more of the hero in this story. I don't know this story, but
yeah, but anyway, she has this idea of like, well, you did it now, so basically just let's get married, even though it's weird. Let's you know because the act is done, and
yeah,
we
life in the ancient world is hard for my soft ass to imagine.
and oh, and actually back to the Job thing. There's one line at the end of Job that caught my attention a lot, just as it's in my head now, at least now because I've been looking at this stuff. But there's a line where after all of that whole book and Job is restored at the end, there's this deal where he has new sons, he has new daughters. The daughters are the most beautiful thing that you'll ever see in the world, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And then of all things, there's this one line where it says, and Job treated his daughters to the same inheritance that his sons would get.
Huh.
And it's like, I've never seen it before, never thought about it before. And then I was like, what the hell is that doing in this book? Like, are they even back then making some kind of comment about an equality between sons and daughters, or the ideal father would have something else in his head, kind of thing?
Well, there's no way this conversation hasn't been going on, for as long as we can possibly, for as long as people have been living together in these groups, right? You take a look at, just go to my back alley here and hang out with the other neighbors, and the men kind of congregate in one area slowly, like the couples all come together and then slowly move apart again. And
Yeah.
they come together as couples and go apart as sexes.
There's a long history, even like if you.
So there's no way the groups don't talk about each other, and there's no way they don't even conspire a little bit here and there. And there's things going on that level, and have been for a very long time. And I kind of reject the notion that feminism is some new idea. I'm sure that this is an ongoing conversation that's been happening for a long time, and the two sides fighting for power or respect or balance or something in order to just get along and move forward, because we have to somehow, right?
Yeah. Actually, in some ways, that's where I am now with the conclusion, because of this sort of looking at the book of Job again, and looking at Jung's answer to Job and some other things. So he had this idea of a conjunction of opposites, but he also brings up lightly this idea of a marriage of opposites. And
Mm-hmm.
the marriage of opposites thing is kind of in my head a bit now, where I'm thinking, is that maybe actually the better solution, where it's in a sense you have these two obviously different things, but you're bringing them into a union where you're kind of saying you're co-authorities, you're now a team, and abstractly you're now one. You're going to have to contend with each other and decide who's in charge of this or that. But the marriage at least is sort of like almost a conscious recognition, right? It's a conscious thing of saying, I'm identifying with you, you're identifying with me.
Mm-hmm.
There's something bigger between us than just what I want out of you.
Well, there's obviously enough that we share, despite the seemingly opposite. Because it's a weird thing, right? Like throughout this book, I got the feeling that you weren't just focused on the daughter archetype or the notion of the daughter in story, or all the things it's ostensibly about, but that in a part of you was trying to come to terms with who you are and how you've moved through life, and your struggle to try to deal with finding meaning in story or religion or myth or whatever you want to call it. And how do you deal with the metaphysical aspect of that? Like, I know you make it clear that you don't necessarily have to believe those things, but you also don't make it clear that there's no power in that, and that you want to entirely let it go, because there's a part of you that seems to sort of like the magic of it or the mystery of it to some degree. You can't abandon it entirely. Am I wrong?
Oh no, yeah, that's exactly right. Actually, one of my other reviewers made some comment about how it seemed like a great book for a crisis of faith and then a restoration or reconstruction of faith. And I've definitely had to deal with that in terms of, just processing all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And in some respects, though, it's always going to come down to the mystery of it, because you're not going to solve these things in a human shell and a human perspective kind of element. But there's this weird participation in story, I think, that is what captured my mind for that particular thing. And it's the role of fiction in faith. It's the role of like participating in something that's maybe abstractly true, but it's not necessarily the case that it's, historically, materially true, if you know where I'm going with that.
Oh, yeah. And like you mentioned about Northrop Frye, you can't really, when he talks about that, you can't really separate the Bible as history or not history. It's not that simple.
Yeah, exactly. It's certainly not that. And as soon as you start talking, as soon as you start making statements, there's that element of like, you're telling stories. You're not actually recounting the factual, evidential, what really happened in a physical material place. And so it's almost part of that barrier of the barrier of consciousness, maybe, of some kind, where we're stuck here, but we can participate in a weird way too.
Right. Well, the in some ways, the better the story, the higher the chance you're going to get something out of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, if you're telling a story to somebody about something that happened to you in your life, what's more important? Giving an objective journalistic account of the details to that person so that they can hear exactly what happened to you, as if they give a shit, or trying to find, I'm obviously selling one side more than the other by how or trying to find a way to give them as impactful a story as possible so they can take something away from it at the end. Now, it's obvious where I'm sitting on that, but it's one of those things where we often will complain that the fish is getting bigger in the story. But if the story entertains you more at the end, or like you get a bigger fictional meal of these fish, then maybe so be it. It's not such a big deal. It's only a big deal when you're actually trying to recount events in a straightforward journalistic fashion. It's only then that the storytelling can become a problem.
And maybe in the sense of control or possession element of it. Like if you possess the story, if it's yours, if it's a piece of property, that's a different attitude towards like that whole element, compared to something like, say, I'm involved in the story. I have a role in the story.
Yes.
There are two different ways of kind of going about that, I guess. In some ways, though, I think that's probably why it wasn't really my intent at the beginning to bring in so much sci-fi for the book. But at the same time, it's where I was, right?
I saw your graph. You have nerd in your blood. You can't help yourself.
Exactly. But at the same time, it's like you're saying with story, where like with sci-fi, like it didn't happen. Like it's purely imaginative. It's purely fictional. And yet at the same time, there's this weird involvement in it. There's this weird, this is such an involving, great story that it's going to affect how I behave in the future, let's say. It may, the fact that people are building lightsabers and they really do want to make a lightsaber that's going to cut through things.
Yeah. Or that it became a recognized religion in England.
Yeah.
Now, joke or not, a joke like that is not totally a joke.
Yeah. How many things start with it? Like, how many things have a great start that's just like, hey, that's funny. Want to try that? And then next thing you know, people adopt it and adopt it and adopt it.
Well, and if you pretend long enough, you'll start to believe it.
Yeah. And so that was, again, sort of, that became, I guess, maybe the what I was wrestling with in terms of, it doesn't have to be that historical material accurate thing. it has to be, what does it do to you? What does it compel you into? Does it make you a better person? Does it make you aim at things better?
Right. And so the issue with, I mean, if a daughter, and especially a virgin daughter, becomes, despite the story of Isaac and Abraham, if that becomes the most famous symbol of sacrifice, and I'd say it to some degrees it does. You know, when South Park has their little episode in the rainforest, and someone has to get sacrificed to the evil monster in the jungle, you know, it's a woman, it's a cheerleader they put up there, and she's, oh God, come help me. You know, becomes the sacrifice, and you read story after story after story where that's the case. Even if you're thinking, well, they're sacrificing this virgin daughter, clearly because they've chosen that, that's the greatest thing they have, which is why the sacrifice is so powerful.
Yeah.
But that's a crappy defense if you're a daughter.
Yeah, it's like, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah, like story-wise, I get it. But if you're a daughter reading that, or you're someone else reading that, even who has a daughter or is going to date someone's daughter, whatever, you're going to be involved with a daughter at some point in time in your life, and now you're going to have that imprinted on you to some degree. This is the greatest sacrifice. Not the greatest part is easy to miss when that word sacrifice comes so soon afterwards, right?
For sure. So Northrop Frye has an idea around this. I think I kind of tried to grab a little bit of that from him, but like in the Bible in particular, since it's sort of one of those, you know, it's one of those monster literature packages of history. He's got this idea of like a type and then an antitype, and the Abraham story is obviously sort of fitting into that element of a type. Like it's a type of story, and it's a greatest sacrifice story. But the Bible always kind of has this weird reflection back of like, you know, saying, okay, that happened as a story, let's say. Now let's look at it from a different angle 200 years later or whatever. And so you get this weird kind of these reflections. And that's where this Jephthah character in the story with his daughter comes too. You have an Abraham character where this guy's, you know, he's fairly independent, fairly leader. He's a leader of kinds, but he gets it in his head that he's got to sacrifice his kid. And of all things, instead of being stopped at that moment, he goes through with it. And so it's this antitype to Abraham, right? Like
right.
And again, that was sort of one of these, like, you know, flashes for me for the book, whereas like I better start there, because at least that's far enough back that it's, you know, it's putting things into perspective. And there's a difference between the Abraham Isaac story and the Jephthah and his daughter story. And that daughter word is there, and the daughter doesn't even have a name in the story. Mm-hmm. So, you know, like what are we missing if 3 billion, 4 billion people in the world think the Abraham story is that important? But we don't seem to think this other one is that important.
Where they follow through.
Where they follow through.
Right. Yeah. So you figure that it should be more, I mean, I'm just guessing, but that